pleased to be able to introduce a new friend. Renee, thank you for coming onto the program. You have experienced a lot that needs to be told about the trans movement and different facets of it. You and I first were introduced to one another, I think, from your posting online on social media. And there's usually a story behind that. So you have quite the story that people need to understand so that they can better protect women and children. That's what we're all about here on Unmasking the Trans Movement. We're not anti anything. Well, we're anti-perpetration, but we are for survivors and we are for protecting women and children. So talk to us about your concerns and your experience with the trans movement, as well as then what often goes unnoticed and what is being reframed are the indicators of sexual abuse. So talk to us about how we connected and then share with us your story.
Okay. Well, I first encountered interviews with you from over the internet on YouTube. I first became interested in listening to stories of detransitioners when Jordan Peterson had interviewed Chloe Cole. And so from that interview, I started listening to other detransitioner interviews. And so in the course of that, you came up on some of the interviews, either with Jordan Peterson or Benjamin Boyce, the Voice of Reason. I believe you were on his program too. And so as I listened to you talk about the trans movement and groomers and perps and the people that you worked with in the prison system, your research jived with research that I'd done between 15 or 20 years ago or so. My son was a baby. And the research, I did the research initially as a survivor because I had this infant son and I wanted to, what makes a pedophile? How do I avoid them? You know, and coming from a background, my brother is a pedophile. And so one of the things that you said, you noted that there's no evidence that sex offenders were sexually abused and that they were enacting out their trauma. That struck a chord with me because of a research study I'd come across in a book that it was an interesting study. It was a metadata study. And it started probably in the early 80s, the study. They collected all this data from CPS and law enforcement and hospitals and stuff like that of kids who had founded instances of sexual abuse. And they said, okay, they're saying that these perpetrators are enacting their trauma. So if that's true, then years into the future, we should find these victims on sex offender registries. So they collected this data for like 20 years. And guess how many sex offenders they found that were verified to have been sexually abused? 0. Nobody's name turned up on the sex offender registry who had been on the sexual abuse information that they gathered from CPS and law enforcement and hospitals and stuff like that from years prior. So I'm like, when you said, yeah, there's no evidence that they're enacting their trauma, I remembered that study and I'm like, yeah, absolutely, you're right. And so, yeah, that's as things unfolded and my son got older, I started, I'll get to the issue that we had that brought me to contact you in a minute. But as far as research studies go, fast forward 10 years, 2011, 2012, 2014, I was going to college working toward a master's degree in clinical social work because I was looking at going into that. And my last semester toward my BA, which was roughly a year's worth of research projects, I was researching homosexuality. And I was researching that specifically because I knew that population was a frequent consumer of mental health services. and they have a statistically higher rate of depression and anxiety and suicide, plus domestic violence, which is all the same elevated issues you see in the trans movement too. And so looking back, I was listening recently to an interview you were doing with a bunch of medical professionals, and it dawned on me that the same lines and justifications for the narrative for homosexuality that had been 15, 20 years ago, between 1995 and 2000, the I can't help myself, I was born this way narrative. It was all the same lines. It was all the same idea that you now hear with the trans movement. So that struck my attention, and I'm like, well, that's really interesting. And so I started thinking back to the research I was doing in college. And one of the things I noticed is that the research studies that were recent when I was doing the research in like 2015 started to support this narrative. So I'm like, well, is that true? So I started to go back and look at the research from the 70s and 80s about homosexuality, because, you had the new research and you had the old research, and they were saying two different things. And so I'm like, well, where'd this come from? So back when I did studies in college, I started digging back into the history of the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Health.
That's right. There you go. Yep.
And the DSM-3 was the one in the 80s, and then the DSM-4 came along. And the DSM-3, I believe that one had homosexuality in it as a psychiatric disorder. And then it was taken
as a matter of fact, people can see the DSM-5 right behind me.
Yep.
So that's the diagnostic manual that has all the billing codes. And in 2013, that's when the DSM-5 came out. That's what made all this billable. So just so that people, as you're talking about the different versions of the DSM, without those volumes behind me, so they've even come up with now the text revision, the TR, just recently. We would not have the trans movement because it couldn't be billable.
Well, the interesting thing is the reason they took homosexuality out is because the gay rights agenda had gone in and basically attacked the American Psychological Association and forced their hand to take this stuff out of here because they didn't want to, at the time it was, we don't want to be seen as a mental health issue, but now you get the trans movement. Well, if I want surgery, I want to be seen as a mental health issue so I can get the insurance company to pay for it. And it's the same narrative, it's the same, I can't help myself, I was born this way. The trans movement uses that, which is the same narrative we're now seeing as the minor attracted persons. Same thing. I remember one data study I ran across. He was a fella in the early 80s that was working with homosexuals in San Francisco. And he was a researcher psychologist. And back in the early 80s, when the AIDS epidemic started, there had these bathhouses in San Francisco. And if you've ever watched the movie Philadelphia, I believe it is, that gives the whole story about that. The people running these bathhouses utilized by the gay community so they could have their hookups. They didn't want to be shut down because they were making gobs of money. This is always about somebody's making money. That's
right. It's certainly not about health because they can have, I don't know how many partners per night in the gay bathhouses. And you notice these are male bathhouses. You never hear of female bathhouses. People need to understand that there is a difference between male and female sexuality.
And so what the fella who had done the research, when AIDS started and everybody was scared, the bathhouses shut down within a matter of months. And the gay men, I can't help myself, I was born this way. Well, all of a sudden their behavior changed pretty drastically. And that was one thing he pointed out. He's like, well, if you can decide to stop having sex with multiple men a night, then evidence you're not born this way, because there is a decision making process going on in your conscience, in your brain, about your behavior somewhere. And so the other thing we noticed that changed in the 80s from the homosexuals into now is the effeminate acting gay went out of vogue. And you see more gay people now that are talking about monogamous long-term relationships, particularly now that the gay marriage has passed and states will allow, homosexual couples to put each other on their insurance, and, they can write each other in their will and stuff like that, which, you should be able to put in your will who you want, and put on your insurance. Yeah, I think there's some gray area there. But yeah, the narrative, the same messages from the late 80s all the way through, it's the same narrative. They just changed the faces on who they want you to accept. So I found that fascinating. And so this is where you get into the minor attracted person, same idea.
Yeah, and so, the acronym is MAP. And so if anybody's ever heard of MAPS, and that is a misnomer, right? It's been a term that's been concocted or just manufactured. So minor attracted persons, right? They're rebranding pedophilia, and they're claiming that these people are non-offending pedophiles.
Yep.
That is a ruse. The best way to understand it is these are pedophiles that are yet to be busted because they've been tricky enough to stay one step ahead of law enforcement.
And here's where we get into why I contacted you. My son, who is currently 21, he has a developmental disability. He has refractory epilepsy, and it affects his memory and his language processing. And he also has some kind of autistic type characteristics, but he's not technically autistic.
You want to describe, Renee, would you describe some of those characteristics? Because you've just listed one of the key characteristics for those young people that make perfect targets for predators that have embedded themselves within the trans movement.
One of the things with my son, and this is probably just has to do with his epilepsy and his schooling, because he had such a difficult time learning. Eventually he was removed from the brick and mortar school system, and he had tutors, and he was homeschooled. Some of the tutors were provided through the school district. The homeschool, I just hired someone to teach him because I'm like, I can't do this. And so through most of high school, he was out of the brick and mortar school system, and he had a tutor for art classes, and he had a tutor for computer stuff, and then he had reading and math tutors. He never attained a high school diploma because the epilepsy interfered with his ability to remember stuff to be able to do the work required for high school. So he doesn't have a high school diploma.
But as far as though the autism, can you describe some of the indicators or symptoms?
Well, because he is behind so much developmentally, the immaturity that's associated with not really understanding, not being able to pick up on this person that's talking to you that thinks your little giggle is so cute and, is encouraging you to do this, is, you think it's funny, you think you have a friend, even if you are 20 years old and this seems okay to you, the thought that goes in the back of my mind is the adult 40-year-old or 30-year-old on the other end of the internet is looking at porn or masturbating or doing whatever to your little innocent exchange, or what you think is an innocent exchange.
Right. So your son online began to meet some friends, but autism, they have a hard time processing social cues. They're very concrete in the reasoning, and therefore they have a hard time with their intuition, and thus they are sitting ducks for predators to begin to manipulate them, which is another word for grooming. They begin to work these kids. These kids tend to be very bright. They go online. They know how to work that world.
Yeah.
Yet they're not equipped in terms of personal defenses, as it were, to discern. So they have a hard time discerning somebody's motives and intentions.
My son is, because of the struggles he's been through, which we'll get into some of this later. The medical issues. His dad committed suicide. So, there's all these things stacked on there. He's very empathetic, which this is why he doesn't qualify as somebody with autism, because he is too socially aware. And so because he's empathetic to the struggles of other people, he's also quite choosy about his friends. He won't, associate with people that are mean and negative and so on and so forth. And most of his online friends are professing Christians. And this is where it gets interesting, because he came to me with a letter. He had some things listed out of something that he called a femboy style. And basically to him, this was, I want some arm covers and I want some knee-high socks and stuff like that. And so when I read the letter, I'm kind of like, well, this is odd. Where did you get this from? And so he got it from this friend who claims to be his age, who claims to be a Christian, but is endorsing this stuff. And I'm like, wait a minute, we got a problem.
And this is an online friend.
Yeah, this is an online friend. This isn't somebody he knows in person. This is somebody that claims to be a Christian, and is either it's another young person who is in serious trouble, or it's a groomer. This friend has admitted to my son that he has a porn addiction. I had an interesting conversation with my son actually yesterday. I asked him, well, how's your friend? And he's like, well, I haven't heard from him in a while. Interesting. And then I said, if I hope he's doing well. I hope he, because a friend says he's in treatment. I hope he's continued with his treatment. He says he's in treatment for porn addiction. And he's like, well, I don't know. And I said, people that voluntarily go to treatment, like a 12-step group, like there's Sex Addicts Anonymous and stuff like that, people that voluntarily go to these, that's one thing. But if your friend's in a program where insurance is paying for it, he's probably there because court sent him there because he came to the attention of the criminal justice system. And instead of my son arguing with me, he looked at me and said, yeah, Mom, that's true. Or that would be true. I could see where that's true. So this conversation I've been having with him over this friend for a couple of months now, has gone from him being angry at me to him saying, yeah, Ma, you got some points, or yeah, that's true. Or to now it's like, well, Mom, yeah, I agree with you. And so it's been a good growth that way for him. But yeah, one of the things, when he talked to me about the friend being addicted to porn, I had looked up on just a simple Google search, femboy style. And I got pictures of little kids, little boys, or young adult men that either looked like they were trafficking victims or they looked like they were male prostitutes. And I showed him the pictures and I said, this is not, if you look up Native American style, you don't see something like this. If you look up Western style, you see cowboys on horses riding around on the range. You don't see people posed in seductive.
And that's Renee, what you're saying is so crucial for parents, especially parents of boys.
Yep.
But it's going to be the same thing, though a little bit different for girls. Girls, of course, are going to end up being more masculine, or they're going to end up on OnlyFans, showing themselves off, which is they're ripe for then somebody finding them. But for parents of boys, what you're saying is you started to see that there was something going on. Your son was starting to express interest in this femboy style. You started to look into this, and before you know it, it is one step away, or it leads into what eventually is called sissy porn. So
Yeah.
it's taking these young men that have difficulty with their emotions, social cues, and before you know it, they're being groomed incrementally and they don't know it. And the things they start asking, let's say, their parents for in terms of style of clothing should raise some red flags.
Yeah, my son had admitted to me in part of this that he felt feminine. And I remember taking him into the bathroom. We got this giant mirror, and I stood him in front of the mirror and looking at him and me. I'm like, look at you. You're 6'1", you're 220 pounds. You look like a guy. You dress like a guy. You talk like a guy. You walk like a guy. You think like a guy. What makes you think you're feminine? And he's like, well, I've always felt that way. And he always equated toxic masculinity to his dad's behavior of not being able to cope well with life on life's terms. His father was always frustrated with everything, and it was clear he didn't have very good coping skills. He had a couple of affairs, and basically he committed suicide when his second girlfriend broke up with him. So carrying that, my son is like, but when I pointed these things out to him, he was kind of like, well, Mom, I guess I see a point. And then getting feedback from other men too. He's in martial arts. His epilepsy has caused problems. His epilepsy medication has caused problems with osteoporosis. So we're using that as a form of physical therapy. And his sensei always jokes about him beating him up during his lessons. Don't beat me up. And the sense he's a master black belt. The sensei is. So it's not like my son is any threat to this guy, physically, but he having interaction with other men to validate his masculinity is important. And this is why I think kids, whether you have a daughter, you have a son, they need to be around other people, peers that reinforce you are male, you are female. And if you're male or if you're female, yeah, you got the biology on either end of this, but in the middle of this, people's temperaments run a gambit.
And that's key, right? It's not gender fluid. It happens to be temperament.
Yep.
And Renee, you also highlighted a very key point, which is there's a lot of mental health issues.
Yep.
Now, in your particular case, your son's case, what I would say is he is dealing with or was dealing with depression. How could he not? Any young person who has experienced separation or divorce or suicide of a parent, those are going to be significant adverse childhood experiences. So these groomers, these perpetrators, those that are pushing the trans deception know that at the very least, they're dealing with kids that are vulnerable because of past traumas.
And my son also, we were in a catastrophic car accident in 2010. He was 8 years old. And he was in a 5-point harness car seat. And it's probably the only reason he's still alive. He didn't have any broken bones, but yeah, he just about killed both of us. I mean, there were all three of us in the car. And it happened on an Easter Sunday. And 9 o'clock in the morning, 10 o'clock in the morning, we were driving to go get something to eat, and a fellow with dogs in his car went out of his lane and into our lane and hit us head on. And so almost nearly, particularly losing me almost. Then a friend of mine took care of my son for 6 weeks because we were in the hospital. So yeah, there's a lot of pain in his life. We recently came back from Detroit. We went to the Henry Ford Clinic, and we found out that his form of epilepsy is not operable. And we were really hoping that he could, we could stop the seizures so he could get on. Well, let's see what happens if we can stop the seizures, where he lands developmentally. And right now that's off the table. So we have all these traumas, and then we have all this, my future doesn't look very optimistic. My prognosis for my epilepsy is not a very good one. And so, how to help him process through everything that he's been through. And I think it's important for parents to understand that you, as the parent, you do have some of the tools to help your children, because you birthed this child, you grew up with this child. If it's, if you're the father or the mother, you know them, and nobody has, speaking normal parents, parents that genuinely love their kids, nobody has an ill intent for their kid. And so they, you as the parent, you have the capacity to help them. And you are probably the biggest certainly long-term influence in their lives.
Renee, that is a good word of encouragement. We're up against the clock for this first episode. Would you be willing to stick around for part 2?
Sure.
Because what you shared with me, and it would require then part 2. And I want people to know that what you're going to be sharing in the second half is your story of abuse.
Yes.
And that is so crucial, because just as you have done a wonderful job helping parents understand, especially parents of special needs boys or boys that don't fit the typical societal masculine stereotype, that you've helped them see some of the indicators, how those kids could be set up to be groomed. But there's a significant concern that I have, that you share, that within the trans movement, there is a reframing of what used to be known in mental health as the indicators of sexual abuse.
Yes.
Now it's being reframed in terms of gender. And especially for girls, it's going to be very true for boys, but all the more so for girls. And unless we can help the mental health field, which has been captured by this ideology, and unfortunately then what it means is mental health professionals during their training are no longer being trained effectively as mandated reporters. They are being trained to fast track kids off to gender clinics. And so they are missing very vital and important, and it used to be time-tested, red flags of abuse. And if I, as a therapist, don't know what to look for, I'm not going to begin to ask the right questions, because very few, if any, survivors or kids that are actively being perpetrated upon are going to come right out and say, I'm being abused. They're going to drop hints. And if we aren't bright enough to pick up on those, or if I have blind spots now because of my training as a clinician, I'm never going to be able to connect the dots. And so I will then add insult to injury, sending this kid off for quote unquote gender affirming treatment, which is the exact opposite of what they need. They need trauma therapy instead. So
and here's where the greed plays into this, because these kids got giant dollar signs on their head, both for the pharmaceutical industry as well as the people doing the transition surgery.
That's right.
I think that's where the basis of this is just plain old fashioned greed.
That's right. We don't want to think that medical professionals and big pharma would ever be greedy, would ever be interested, never. Right? And would ever be interested.
COVID never taught us any of that. No,
they certainly wouldn't. And they would never want patients for a lifetime. And that is what the trans movement offers, these so-called ethical professionals, which are really unethical.
Yeah.
Renee, thank you. Stay right there. We will pick it up on the other side of this episode. And Brad, it's been compelling as always. Thank you for what you do on behalf of women and children. We're endeavoring to protect them on this episode. And there we go. Okay, wonderful. It flies. Time flies when we're doing this.
I know it does, doesn't it?
Right? We just skimmed the surface. So
yeah.
Okay, I'll take another sip of my tea here. Okay. How do you feel? You feel okay?
Yep, I'm plugging.
There you go. Okay, so let's go to about 120. How's that? So I'll make a little note.
Okay.
There we go. Okay, we'll count down here. Two, three, or what? I can't, 3, 2, and 1. Brad, thank you. And it is a pleasure and a privilege to welcome Renee back to the program. Renee, on part 1, we discussed the concerns you have for your son. Fortunately, he is now rethinking his own sexuality, that he realizes he doesn't have to be a femboy, that probably he was being groomed online by either a peer that was heavily involved in pornography, had a porn addiction, or more than likely because this supposed friend isn't communicating with him very much, the groomer decided to go elsewhere. So unfortunately, he dodged a bullet, and he has a mother that's involved and saw the warning signs.
Yes.
Renee, you also, during our conversations in the past, you have raised concerns how young women are now, especially minors, what used to be called tomboys, are being fast-tracked into and facilitated because of their confusion. They don't fit into the stereotype what we are seeing. It's always put out by advertising, and they more than likely have a background also in some sort of abuse, some sort of sexual violation, and therefore they are recoiling. It used to be that the stats, as far as gender confusion, it was always boys. Suddenly, with trans deception, with the trans movement, we see this massive spike for girls questioning their own gender. Speak to that issue, and let's talk about your story, because as you indicated, the symptoms that you were exhibiting as a young person would now be ripe for an agenda-driven professional or a dangerously ignorant professional to reframe these in terms of gender, and then off to the gender clinic they're going to be sent, and and thus the process of medicalization, which is sterilization, and then eventually amputation, meaning surgery, a removal of sex organs, dumping them off on a surgeon's gurney. So talk to us about your experience, and it will be imperative that professionals as well as parents begin to understand the indicators and the dynamics of abuse.
Well, obviously, there's a lot of kids, teenagers that feel uncomfortable in their bodies for various reasons. But sexual abuse is probably one of the primary reasons why that happens. Now, I can tell my story. I can tell it from. It'll sound a lot like a court testimony, because the emotional aspect of the story can be difficult without getting stuck between the present and the past somewhere in that 1,000-mile stare. You look at pictures of veterans in the middle of a war, and they're like,
I was going to say that's very indicative. That's right. That's PTSD. That's right.
And so for anybody that wants to read how the recovery process unfolded for me, I am on fan fiction, and I'm under the title The Writer's Pen, RIGHTERZPEN. That is my pen name. And so if you go on fan fiction and you look it up, there's a whole slew of stories and Bible studies and stuff on there. I have my mini autobiography, which is kind of a summary of life events. And then I have a story I wrote called Ask Me, which is from an Amy Grant song, Ask Me How I Know There's a God Up in the Heaven. And the song is about, a young woman coming through healing from sexual abuse. So the story is it's a historical novel. And so, it's interesting. It's not conventional Christian fiction, because there's a lot of heavy subject material in it. But, if anybody wanted to, was interested in reading that, then, reading those, then that's It's on fan fiction. Um, so yes, my story, obviously, as a survivor, um, when I was a tomboy, according to the definition of a tomboy in the 70s. I'm 52 years old. I've been in counseling for, in recovery of some form or another for probably 40 years. I started counseling through the school when I was 13 years old because mom was an alcoholic. And then I disclosed it to the counselor when I was 14 that I had been sexually abused. And so, yeah, 14, 15, 16, I ran around in army clothes. The very different world. Me and my friends, we played tag outside and stuff like that. And so we were active that way physically. Um, but yes, if I was a teenager today and somebody told me I could fix all your problems by changing your gender, I'd probably be signing myself up for hormone replacement therapy, or hormone treatment. Um, it was hard to address the pain because nobody wants to dig down in those holes in the soul that these kind of things cause, because it hurts. It really does. But there's no quick fix. There's no surgeon's knife is going to fix the pain inside of us.
And that's what's so diabolical and tragic, that you
Yeah.
take young girls that now enter their teen years that have undiagnosed trauma because nobody spent the time with them, and now you're going to talk about sterilizing them and removing their sex organs, which won't touch the inner pain, and then eventually they realize what happened, and now they've got additional trauma on top of trauma because they trusted the professionals. Renee, what would have been some of the indicators of your sexual abuse that were somehow either missed or overlooked by professionals, by teachers? And
Well, I was a kind of unusual case because I'm pretty sure that if I was born in the 1990s, they probably would have stuck me in foster care pretty quickly. 1970s, the Child Protective had just come on the scene in like 1972 in New York State. And so the person that was perpetrating the abuse was my brother, who was 6 years older than me. And he abused all three of, there's three sisters and one brother. He abused all three of his sisters.
And that's important for people to understand.
Yep.
So as I deal with sex offenders, have been doing that for 15 years, along with regular kind of counseling in the other half of my life. People need to understand that once a young man crosses certain lines and he's saturating himself with pornography, once he enters deviance, oftentimes, especially if it's incest, it's going to continue from one sibling to the next to the next. He will strategically stop at a certain point so he doesn't get busted. And then there's other dynamics going on in the home to where either a parent is turning a blind eye or choosing not to see maybe one of the same. So as you say, your mother was an alcoholic. So speak to some of what I've just said, these indicators, and then the family dynamics.
Well, buried in the family dynamics is some of the indicators. The story of how this unfolded in me and my siblings starts with my mother. Both of my parents were born during World War II. And my mother, was raised by her grandmother until she was 6 years old. Her mom had been married twice, so she had a half brother from another father, and then she was 10 years younger. And so she moved when grandma died, she moved in with her parents, and the sexual abuse of her started then. And for whatever happened in my mother psychologically, this relationship between her and her brother continued well into her marriage. And my dad talked about that after my mom died. how does this happen? And some of these I still don't have answers to. I don't know. But
So mother
so
was a victim of incest.
yes.
She was traumatized. She turns to alcohol. And because of past trauma, that's going to affect her ability to parent and to implement boundaries and to protect her own daughters.
Yeah. My brother started with kind of like peeping Tom type of stuff when I was 4 or 5 years old. And I remember a very young age somewhere witnessing part of some of these episodes between my mother and her brother. So how much my own brother saw, I have no idea. Um, and so maybe at 11 years old, maybe he thought this behavior was normal. And I don't know if what all happened, what he saw or what went on or what mom told him. My brother seemed to grow up with an attitude that he was entitled to whatever he wanted, regardless of what that cost anybody else. And that is clearly an upbringing. When you start talking about things like attachment theory, that's part of that dynamic. There's the mother that's ambiguously attached to the child, so the child gets mixed messages. My parents knew about the sexual abuse. I told my mom. I told her when I was 4 that this, and she said, "Oh, I'll take care of it." And then when it continued into molestation by the time I was 7 or 8 years old, I told my mom again, and she's like, "Whatever you do, don't tell your father because he'll be mad." And I'm like, "Well, maybe somebody should tell dad because this needs to stop." And she said to me, "Well, your father will beat your brother up. And if you tell your father, then I'm going to beat you up. So you know what it feels like." And so at that point, it was like, and there
So here
wasn't,
you're being perpetrated upon.
oh,
You
yep,
reach out to your mother for help, and then she threatens to physically harm you if you
yes,
disclose.
yes. And so there was an instance when I was in second grade. So I was probably about 8 years old when this happened. So my next oldest sister would have been 10, and my oldest sister would have been 12, and my brother was 14. Me and my next youngest sister were hiding in the closet, and we could hear my older sister downstairs screaming. Mom and dad weren't home. My brother was attacking her. And mom and dad got home and she told dad what happened. And she had scratches on her and bruises and so this started this incredible fight between my parents because dad's like, "We need to call the police." And mom said, "Well, if you call the police, then I'm going to tell them that you're the one that violated your daughter." And so it was like 3 o'clock in the morning, mom and dad screaming at each other. Dad took my brother out in the backyard and beat him. And then.
So up to that point, your dad, as far as you could tell, he did not know what was going on?
I don't think he knew until I think he suspected things. And here's, when you talk about survivors being protectors, I wonder about my dad. He never, I think I asked him at one point if anything like that had ever happened to him, and he kind of hesitated to answer. But yeah, he certainly had a brother that had sexual deviant behavior.
On both sides of the family.
Yep. And so dad, I remember him, he'd get these funny looks on his face, like, "What are you doing?" Looking at my brother, because things would come out that just seemed odd, like, "Oh, my brother's my boyfriend." And dad'd be like, "What do you mean by that?" And so
there's an example of a kid
Yep.
dropping a hint.
Yep.
So let's say that happened in a therapist's office. Right? If a therapist isn't free to follow up with additional questions to explore that, then a kid isn't going to continue to drop hints. So if a therapist is trained to continue to redirect indicators back to gender, then they're never going to help a child, because a child by this time, I would imagine, you're already evidencing behavioral issues, depression, anxiety. For kids, we call it agitated depression. Kids aren't sophisticated enough to do depression properly,
Yeah.
meaning like with adults, when we get depressed, we pull the covers over our heads. Kids will get agitated.
Well, children, they'll also wet themselves. Bedwetting past the age of being toilet trained is an indicator of something's going on, unless there's a medical issue. Like my son, he'd have seizures and he'd wet the bed, he'd be 8 years old. And so that was kind of, all right, well, it happens. And we just changed the sheets and let him go back to sleep. But yeah, I was wetting myself. I didn't want to take showers. I would go to school dirty. I smelled, and yeah, teachers asked questions. Teachers pulled me aside. The incident with my sister, the next day, the second grade teacher asked me, "Why are you so tired all the time?" And because you're always falling asleep in class. And I just said to her, "Well, my sister was raped last night." And the teacher's like, "What?" This is 1978, 1979. And so she asked me, did I know what that meant? And so when I explained it to her, she seemed pretty convinced that I understood what the word rape meant. And so she asked me, "Well, do you know who did it?" And I'm like, "Yeah." "Were the police called?" I said, "Well, Dad wanted to, but they never got called." And so she sent me to lunch. And then after lunch, I came back and we had math class, and she said, "Renee, go to the nurse." And I'm like, "Yay, I don't have to do math." So I go down to the nurse, and, she's sitting at her desk. There was like this hallway that you walked, and you turn the corner because there were these barriers. So you couldn't see into the nurse's office unless you walked down that little hall. I turn around, the nurse is sitting at her desk. There's a woman behind her who had like a gray, almost like a gray suit on, and a name tag around her neck, brown hair, brown curly hair. And the nurse said, "Well, come on in here and sit down." And I walked in, and off to the side behind the barricade where I couldn't see him was an armed police officer. And the lady with the name tag said, "Well, he just has to be here because, the people I work for tell him that he has to be here." And I'm kind of an investigator. I help the police department, determine if somebody was hurt or not. And so she interviewed me, and they came, CPS came, and the police came, and they took my sister, and they took her to the hospital. And she spent all weekend there because this happened on a Friday. And apparently, see, here's where the law gets in the way. And I found out about this from my dad after my mom died. My mom died in 2002. And so Dad lived another 4 years. And so he said he talked to a lawyer about when this stuff he started to know that this stuff was happening. He talked to a lawyer about filing for divorce from my mom. And the lawyer told him, "You'll never get custody of your daughters," because at the time, what was called mother doctrine. And the courts always awarded custody of the kids to the mother. And so in the 80s, that changed because, now the court is hypothetically, or supposed to be, looking for the best interest of the child. So if the mother has major issues and the father is more functional than the mother, if you're looking at things like drug addiction and stuff, or, shared custody. So there was an example of adults that knew something was going on, but couldn't do anything about it. The doctors at the hospital more than likely could not get a GYN exam on my sister unless they had permission from my parents. And that's probably why they never did that. And so, yeah, you see instances, and a lot of people, particularly in my case, it was obvious something was wrong in our home. And, laws and certain things at the time prevented people from doing what they could to actually intervene. And so when you talk about therapists now, the therapists are still trained to for CPS type of thing, to recognize instances of abuse, to whether they think it's sexual or physical. They're still trained to do interviews with kids. And so it is less of an issue of the therapist who just doesn't have the training, as much as the therapist is narrow-minded down a particular agenda, because no therapist is forbidden from interviewing a child and investigating whether or not the therapist believes the child was sexually abused, and to continue treatment for sexual abuse in the way that they're supposed to. You got a fork in the road. Let's go down the trans road, or let's go down the treatment modality road that we're supposed to. And that's a decision the therapist needs to make. And so for those that don't, I start to wonder, okay, who gets kickbacks for what? It's follow the almighty dollar. It usually leads back to that.
That's a very important point, right? What is the motive behind the decision making?
Yeah,
or you can have therapists that have they went into the field. I've been doing therapy for 30 years, and there's usually a reason why somebody wants to become a therapist.
Yeah.
And now the graduate schools are, once upon a time, the emphasis was you have to leave your values at the door. You're values neutral.
Yep.
Now it has shifted to where the therapists are trained in grad school, especially social workers, and a licensed clinical social worker can do therapy, and schools are hiring social workers. That if you have a social worker who is really an activist, who has a mindset, who's bought into the trans deception, and the trans movement has now been around, the myth of this trans has been around for about 20 years. Well, that's long enough now to train an entire generation of therapists. Now they're sitting in front of a young girl. So let's say we've got a young Renee or your sister.
Yeah. Yep.
And we may hear the young adolescent comes in, the young woman comes in and says, "I hate being a girl. I wish I was a boy."
Mm-hmm.
What are therapists?
I think it's more insidious even than what you're saying, because one of the things I knew listening to the detransition stories, my son had confessed to me that he felt feminine, and he got really angry because I said, we need to make sure that we find you somebody to talk about this that we know can help you. Because he said he was going to a therapist through the county, because he's a Medicaid patient. And so I said, we need to find you somebody that you can discuss with this stuff, who isn't confined to follow an agenda. Because California, New York State, all these states, back in the day in the homosexuality, you couldn't use aversion therapy, that they said you can't do that. But now aversion therapy, and the people that struggle with their gender identity, for using the words that they use now, people that struggle with that, to look at issues deeper that's causing that, is now a no-no.
They call that conversion therapy, because the young person, the minor, might decide to not continue down the moving sidewalk toward sterilization and amputation. So it's very much like a cult. The trans activists have captured terminology. Now they've codified it. So you can't do, quote unquote, conversion therapy. Back in the day, our goal as therapists, our role is not to convert anyone. It's to help improve self-esteem. Well, how do you do that? You help someone figure out what their core values are,
Yep.
and act and move towards that in a consistent basis. You help them understand their own values so that they can feel whole on the inside, and you help them develop their individual strengths and competencies. That's how self-esteem is improved, not by chopping off body parts.
Just as the Hippocratic Oath is first do no harm, that should be with the therapists too. First do no harm. And to first do no harm is to allow the patient to figure out what's going on inside them that's causing them their distress, not to tell them this is it. Not to tell them, well, you're feeling distressed because you're really a boy trapped in a girl's body, or vice versa.
So
That's
what these young people need oftentimes is trauma therapy.
Yep.
They need therapists that are willing to explore, not therapists that are willing to fast track, to take the kid at face value, because kids are dropping hints.
Yes.
And they may not drop a hint right away. So they'll come in, or oftentimes these young people are referred, but there's going to be indicators of something going on under the surface. You already mentioned about enuresis, so wetting oneself. What parents of boys need to be mindful of, because this will tend to be a gender typical, and this is very true based upon how boys and young men will process their emotions. 3 significant indicators of serious problems for a boy. So a parent needs to be mindful if you have enuresis or encopresis, so soiling oneself or wetting oneself, but then fire setting and cruelty to animals.
Yeah, that's the precursor to the dark triad that brings about criminal behavior. That's part of that.
That's right. Oftentimes, and most serial murderers will have that. Not every single time, but oftentimes. So if a young boy or a teenager, so parents, if you know of a teenage boy that's evidencing those indicators, fire setting, cruelty to animals, and you're wetting or soiling oneself, that's a serious issue. They often will see that. Those of us that have worked with kids in the foster care system, we often will see that, because many of those kids have been sexually abused. What other indicators, Renee, as far as like for the kids in your family, your siblings and you, that should have raised red flags? For instance, what was your sister indicating? Was there any self-injurious behavior? That is oftentimes going to be evident. Cutting oneself or harming, self-harm.
I had some of that. I didn't cut myself with objects or anything like that, but I'd get so angry that I hit myself.
That's very common.
Suicidality, I think, is another. I've been hospitalized for a suicide attempt. I was 28 years old, and some of that was compounded by Desert Storm and having been in the military. But so there's that aspect. There's promiscuity. I had my next oldest sister became very promiscuous, particularly as a young adult.
That's very common, right?
She would sleep with anybody that smiled at her, pretty much.
Think about what's going on in the trans movement. It's hypersexual.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
And predators know how to spot these wounded kids.
Yeah, and then you'll have, obviously with girls, you have the potential of mysterious pregnancy. That happened with my sister, and then my mother's response. Granted, my sister was 22 years old, and my mother's response was, "You're gonna get an abortion because I know you're not gonna take care of this kid, and I'm not raising a 5th kid." And it, talk about mental health trauma on top of trauma. My sister never recovered from that. She never did. She currently, I think she has some sort of quasi-delusional disorder. I don't know if paranoid is the word I would use. Her she thinks there's ghosts everywhere and there's bad things and she's sort of in this psychic thing, that's kind of the route that she went to try and explain to herself why her life wasn't going in a way that she wished she could establish or accomplish.
Yeah, which is often the case, right, with trauma survivors. Renee, we're coming down to the end. We just have a couple of minutes left. Let's stay on some of the symptoms, some of the indicators that parents should keep an eye out for. Therapists certainly should be aware of this. Teachers should know this. So as you indicated, you were falling asleep in class. So yes. A child that is tired because there was all sorts of trauma going on in the home, all sorts of chaos. As you said, your mother was an alcoholic. So what child can get a good night's sleep with that? They're going to have nightmares. They're hearing screaming. They're hearing domestic
the reason violence. I was up all the time is because my brother would, sneak into our bedroom at 1:00 in the morning. And so somebody, they talk about the women in the prisons with the trans men or men that say that they're women so they can
the deviant men that are making their way into female prisons. That's horrific.
Women,
it's a horrific
they're not getting sleep because somebody's up all the time to try and protect the rest of the clan of the inmates.
That's right. Or the young person, as you said, you never knew if he was going to come in. So you're always having to sleep with one eye open. So this poor little girl is having a chaotic home. And on top of it, she's not getting enough sleep. You said that you were dirty. You remember being physically, you didn't want to take a shower.
Yes.
What was behind that?
Behind that was the feeling that I was lower than the dirt on the ground and I wasn't worth anything. And so I might as well play the part. It's kind of funny because when I was a kid, obviously Peanuts was a big thing. And the character Pigpen, you look at it differently as an adult looking back at trauma recovery. Okay, was that kid just poor or what was going on? But yeah, that was it. I was a target for bullying. I cried a lot because I felt like nobody cared about me. I didn't run away from home because I was always taught that the world outside is evil and they're just going to come and they're going to take you away and you're never going to see us again. And, that was a message my mother said to us, to all of us.
That's right off the movie Tangled, Mother Gothel, how she kept Rapunzel within the tower.
And cults do the same thing with the people that are in the cults. The world outside is evil, whatever the definition of evil is. And, but for the grace of God, being in a public school probably saved my life. Because, if I had been tucked away somewhere where there wasn't anybody to tell, I probably wouldn't be here. I probably would have lost my mind or jumped off a bridge or, I'd probably be dead.
There is another indicator, the suicidality.
Yep.
Fluctuating emotions. Oftentimes it's called bipolar, which really can be an indication of trauma. And the kid doesn't know what to do with that. So you have
intense episodes of rage that are around triggers to the abuse. I remember one kid, I was 16, I was on a school bus and we were getting ready to go home and he was like 13 and he made some stupid comment about fathers having sex with their daughters and made some comment to me about that. And my friend almost literally had to hold me down from killing the kid. it was a trigger. And that's something, and here's the scary part, as someone who was in the military, who's, had combat training, who's had training to, operating weapons and stuff like that. I know I can kill someone. And so, I've had a couple of incidences where people would come up to me and you get that little voice in your head, get out of here, get the hell out of here, get out of here now, because something's wrong with this person. And I'm not talking mental health, because I've worked with people that had schizophrenia. I've worked with people that had, other mental health issues. I'm talking with people, you get a sense something's really not right with them. Get out as fast as you can. And, there were times I wanted to kill my brother, but what stopped me was my son needed a mother more than I needed revenge. And here's where you get into, from the theological standpoint, let vengeance be God's. And at some point, I keep praying that God intervenes, whether or not somebody comes forward and, says he's abusing me, or he drops dead, or dies of a heart attack, or dies in an accident. I have no emotional, no conviction that my prayers are somehow unloving or wrong, because he's, there was a very real reason in Deuteronomy where God told Israel to put sex offenders to death. There was a very real reason for that.
Right. And that's one of the most affirming things, speaking of that term, that you can do for a victim, is help them understand that God cares very intensely on it. Renee, we're up against the clock.
Yeah, I know.
I am very appreciative of that you have been willing to spend these two episodes with us. The first one describing what was happening with your son, how he was being potentially or likely groomed, so that parents can understand the warning signs of that. And then you, from your own story, helping parents and educators as well as therapists, hopefully realize that kids that are being abused are not going to come out with that. And so to reframe and fast track these things toward gender affirming care, which is another word for sterilization and amputation, instead of doing exploratory work, helping the child disclose. The trans movement is now really adding insult to injury, and it's a tragedy what's happening. So thank you for being on our program. Thank you for being a tremendous guest.
Well, thank you for having me. And, if you ever want me to come back and talk more about stuff, I'm willing to do so. So,
We will be doing that sooner rather than later, because you're a wealth of knowledge, as I often say, because you are a subject matter expert, because you have lived this experience. Brad, thank you. This is compelling. It's heart-wrenching to know that young people are going through this, and we are here to try to ensure that professionals then do not add insult to injury by then fast-tracking them toward medicalization.